Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the muddy trenches of World War I, where the crack of rifles and the whistle of artillery shells create a symphony of modern warfare. You can smell the acrid smoke hanging heavy in the air, feel the cold steel of a helmet against your scalp, and taste the metallic temps of fear on your tongue. But tonight, you're not just any soldier, you're witnessing something so bizarre, so utterly anachronistic, that even hardened veterans will stop mid-reload to stare in bewilderment. You probably won't survive this story with your preconceptions about warfare intact, because what you're about to experience defies every rule of modern combat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I love seeing where this story finds you. Whether you're tucked away in a cozy bedroom in Minnesota at midnight, or listening from a bustling cafe in Tokyo at dawn. Now, let's find that cozy spot, pull a blanket around you, and gently drift into tonight's calm adventure. You're standing in a forward observation post somewhere along the Western Front in 1940. The morning mist still clinging to the shell-torn landscape like ghostly fingers. The Great War has evolved into something even more mechanized, more brutal than anyone could have imagined when those first shots rang out in 1914. Around you, soldiers clutch their Lee-Enfield rifles, their knuckles white against the familiar weight of modern weaponry. Machine gun nests bristle with deadly efficiency, and the distant rumble of tanks echoes across no man's land like mechanical thunder. But then you see him. A figure emerges from the communication trench, and your first thought is that someone's lost their mind. He's carrying what appears to be a medieval longbone, a rifle, not a submachine gun, but an honest-to-God 6-foot English longbow that looks like it belongs in the hands of a knight at Agincourt, not a soldier in the 20th century. The man himself is tall and lean, with the kind of confident stride that suggests he's either completely insane or knows something the rest of you don't. This is Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, though his comrades have already started calling him Mad Jack. And you're about to witness why that nickname will follow him through the annals of military history. As he settles into position beside you, you notice he's not just carrying the longbow. There's a set of bagpipes slung across his back, and hanging from his belt is what appears to be a genuine Scottish claymore sword. You want to laugh, but something in his eyes stops you. They're the eyes of a man who's seen combat, who's survived when others haven't, and who's about to show you that sometimes the old ways work better than anyone has a right to expect. The morning briefing crackles through on the radio, and you learn that German forces have established a stronghold in a village about 2 miles ahead. Intelligence suggests they're dug in deep, with machine gun emplacements covering all the obvious approaches. It's the kind of position that would typically require heavy artillery bombardment, followed by a costly infantry assault that would leave half your units scattered across the battlefield. But Mad Jack Churchill has other ideas. As the unit prepares to move out, you watch him test his bowstring with the practiced ease of someone who's been doing this since childhood. The other soldiers are casting sideways glances, some snickering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. You can hear the whispered conversations. Has he lost his bloody mind? What's he going to do? Shoot arrows at panzers? This isn't the Middle Ages, mate. But you notice something else. The seasoned veterans, the ones who've been in this war long enough to recognize competence when they see it, aren't laughing. They're watching Churchill with the kind of respectful attention reserved for someone who's proven themselves in ways that transcend conventional wisdom. The advance begins, and you're moving through terrain that looks like the surface of an alien. Planet shell craters filled with stagnant water, twisted metal jutting from the earth like the bones of some massive beast, and trees reduced to charred stumps that reach toward the sky like accusatory fingers. The smell of cordite and decay hangs heavy in the air, and with each step, you're reminded that death lurks behind every pile of rubble. Churchill moves with the fluid grace of a hunter, and you realize that for him, This isn't just warfare, an art form that he's been perfecting his entire life. Born into a military family, he'd spent his youth mastering archery, not as a hobby, but as a discipline. He'd won competitions, studied the physics of arrow flight, and understood the psychological impact of wielding a weapon that most people considered obsolete. As your unit approaches the German position, you can see the enemy soldiers moving in. Their trenches, they're well positioned, alert, and armed with the latest in military technology. This should be suicide. This should be a bloodbath that ends with your unit scattered across the countryside. But Churchill raises his hand, signaling for the advance to halt. And what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about modern warfare. He notches an arrow with movements so fluid they seem almost ceremonial. The longbow bends under his draw, and you can see the muscles in his back working as he brings the weapon to full extension. For a moment, time seems suspended. Here you are, in the middle of the most technologically advanced war in human history, watching a man prepare to loose an arrow as if he's standing on the fields of Hastings in 1066. The arrow flies. It's not the whistle of a bullet or the roar of an artillery shell. It's something altogether different, a sound that seems to carry centuries of warfare, of knights and longbowmen, of battles fought when honor and skill mattered more than rate of fire. The German soldier it strikes goes down with a look of complete bewilderment, as if he can't quite process what just happened to him. But it's not just the kill that matters, it's the effect on everyone else. The other German soldiers freeze, trying to understand what they've just witnessed. In their minds, they're fighting a modern war against a modern enemy, and suddenly they're facing something that belongs in a museum. The psychological impact is immediate and profound. They're no longer fighting predictable opponents with predictable weapons. They're facing something that doesn't make sense. Something that suggests their enemies might be either completely insane or operating on a level they can't comprehend. Churchill doesn't stop there. He begins moving through the battlefield like a figure from legend, the longbow singing in his hands as arrow after arrow finds its mark. But what you're witnessing isn't just about the weapon, it's about the man wielding it. This is someone who understands that warfare is as much about psychology as it is about ballistics, who recognizes that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to convince them they're fighting something beyond their understanding. The German position begins to falter, not just because of the casualties Churchill is inflicting, but because of the sheer impossibility of what they're seeing. Radio chatter from intercepted communications reveals their confusion. Reports of English soldiers using ancient weapons, requests for clarification about whether they're facing some kind of special forces unit with experimental equipment, and increasingly frantic demands for reinforcements to deal with what they're describing as supernatural opponents. As the assault continues, you see Churchill do something that will become legendary among those who witness it. He sets down his longbow, pulls out his bagpipes, and begins to play. Not a gentle Scottish lament, but a fierce battle tune that echoes across the battlefield like a war cry from another age. The sound cuts through the noise of gunfire and explosions, and for the German soldiers on the receiving end, it must feel like the world has gone completely mad. But there's method to this madness. The bagpipes serve multiple purposes. They boost the morale of Churchill's own troops, who are beginning to understand that they're following someone truly extraordinary. They further demoralize the enemy, who are now convinced they're facing opponents who operate by completely different rules, and they serve as a form of psychological warfare that's more effective than any propaganda. The German position collapses, not because of overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but because the defenders have lost the will to fight an enemy they can't understand. As your unit moves in to secure the area, you find German soldiers who surrendered not because they were outgunned, but because they were convinced they were facing something beyond conventional military logic. In the aftermath, as you're helping to process prisoners and secure equipment, You overhear conversations that will stay with you for the rest of your life. One German officer, speaking broken English, keeps asking about the demon with the ancient bow. Another mentions reports he'd heard from other units about British soldiers who fought like knights from the old stories. The psychological impact of Churchill's unconventional methods has spread far beyond this single engagement. But Churchill isn't finished. Over the following weeks, you become part of a unit that operates like nothing else in the modern military. While other companies rely on overwhelming firepower and coordinated assaults, Churchill's approach blends medieval tactics with modern strategy in ways that consistently confuse and demoralize the enemy. You watch him lead raids where the longbow proves surprisingly effective for silent kills, allowing your unit to eliminate sentries without alerting entire enemy positions. You see him use the psychological impact of his weapons to convince German units that they're facing opponents who might be using experimental technology or special forces training that goes far beyond conventional military doctrine. During one particularly memorable engagement, Churchill approaches a German machine gun nest that has your entire unit pinned down. Instead of calling for artillery support or attempting a flanking maneuver, he does something that defies all military logic. He walks directly toward the enemy position, playing his bagpipes and carrying his claymore sword in one hand and his longbow in the other. The German machine gunners stop firing, not because they've been suppressed or because they're out of ammunition, but because they literally cannot process what they're seeing. Here's a man walking toward them through no man's land, playing music, carrying medieval weapons, and showing absolutely no fear of their modern firearms. It's so far outside their understanding of how warfare works that their training simply doesn't provide a response. Churchill reaches the machine gun nest, and what follows is something that witnesses will struggle to describe for decades afterward, using his claymore with the skill of someone who studied medieval combat techniques. He engages the German soldiers in what can only be described as sword fighting in the middle of World War II. The longbow continues to play a role, allowing him to eliminate threats at a distance before closing for melee combat that his opponents are completely unprepared for. The nest falls, not because superior technology defeated inferior technology, but because unconventional tactics caught a conventional enemy completely off guard. As word of these engagements spreads, Churchill's reputation begins to take on almost mythical proportions. German intelligence starts including warnings about British units that might be using experimental psychological warfare techniques, or special forces trained in unconventional combat. You begin to understand that what you're witnessing isn't just about one man's eccentricity or his attachment to historical weapons. Churchill represents something deeper, the idea that sometimes innovation comes not from embracing the latest technology, but from understanding which old techniques still work and why they've been forgotten. The longbow isn't effective because it's superior to modern firearms, it's effective because no one expects it, because it operates outside the established patterns of contemporary warfare. During quiet moments between engagements, Churchill shares stories that help you understand the philosophy behind his methods. He talks about studying military history, not just as an academic exercise, but as a source of practical tactics that modern armies have abandoned. He explains how psychological warfare often matters more than firepower, how the unexpected can be more valuable than the overwhelming. You learn that his use of the longbow isn't just about nostalgia or showmanship. It's based on careful analysis of its practical advantages in specific situations. The weapon is silent, which makes it ideal for eliminating sentries without alerting nearby enemies. It's reusable, unlike bullets, which means he's never completely out of ammunition as long as he can recover his arrows. And most importantly, it's so unexpected that it often paralyzes enemies who don't know how to respond to it. But perhaps most significantly, you begin to understand that Churchill's methods work because they change the nature of the conflict itself. when you're fighting an enemy who uses conventional tactics with conventional weapons. The battle becomes about who has better equipment, more ammunition, or superior numbers. But when you introduce elements that don't fit established patterns, you force the enemy to fight on unfamiliar ground where their training and experience provide less advantage. As winter approaches, your unit is assigned to hold a section of the line that has been problematic for months. German forces control several key positions that allow them to observe and harass Allied movements. But the terrain makes conventional assaults extremely costly. Previous attempts to dislodge them have resulted in heavy casualties with minimal gains. Churchill studies the situation with the eye of someone who sees opportunities where others see obstacles. The German positions are well fortified against frontal assault and protected by interlocking fields of fire that make approaches predictable and deadly. But they're designed to repel attacks that follow conventional military doctrine. And Churchill has never been particularly interested in conventional military doctrine. His plan, when he explains it to the unit, seems like something from a completely different war. Instead of the coordinated artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assault, that the Germans expect. Churchill proposes something that sounds more like a medieval siege, using the longbow for silent elimination of key targets, followed by psychological warfare designed to convince the defenders that they're facing something beyond their experience. The operation begins before dawn, with Churchill moving through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer. You're following someone who navigates by instinct and experience, who seems to understand how light and shadow, wind and weather can be used as weapons just as effectively as arrows and steel. The first German sentry dies without ever knowing what killed him. An arrow from a longbow doesn't announce itself the way a rifle shot does. There's no muzzle flash, no distinctive crack that reveals the shooter's position. One moment the sentry is scanning the approaches to his position, the next he's collapsing, silently with a shaft through his chest. But it's what happens next that transforms a simple elimination into something approaching psychological torture for the remaining German defenders. Instead of pressing the attack or attempting to exploit the breach in their perimeter, Churchill does something completely unexpected. He begins to play his bagpipes. The sound echoes across the battlefield, like a challenge from another century. For the German soldiers, who are already on edge from the unexplained death of their comrade, the bagpipes represent something that doesn't fit into any tactical framework they understand. They're expecting return fire, flanking movements, artillery, bombardment, all the familiar elements of modern warfare. Instead, they're hearing music that seems to come from the pages of medieval history. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. Radio intercepts reveal increasing panic among the German defenders as they struggle to understand what they're facing. Reports describe British special forces using unconventional psychological warfare and requests for immediate reinforcement to deal with what some are calling supernatural attacks. Churchill continues his advance, and you're following someone who moves through the battlefield like he owns it. The longbow continues to claim targets with almost supernatural precision, while the bagpipes create an atmosphere of dread that seems to sap the defenders' will to fight. German soldiers who should be maintaining disciplined fields of fire are instead huddling in their positions, afraid to expose themselves to an enemy they can't understand. When Churchill finally draws his claymore and charges the main German position, what follows is something that military historians will struggle to categorize for decades. This isn't medieval combat. The setting, the supporting weapons, the tactical situation are all thoroughly modern. But it isn't modern combat either, because one of the participants is fighting according to rules that his opponents don't understand and can't counter. The German position falls with surprisingly few casualties on both sides. Not because the defenders were overwhelmed by superior firepower, but because they lost the psychological battle before the physical confrontation ever began. By the time Churchill reached their trenches, Many of the German soldiers were already looking for opportunities to surrender to an enemy who had convinced them that conventional resistance was pointless. In the aftermath, as your unit secures the position and processes prisoners, you witness something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. German officers, men who have been trained in the most advanced military academies in Europe, are struggling to write reports that accurately describe what happened to them. How do you explain to your superiors that your position was overrun by a single British officer armed with medieval weapons? How do you report that your soldiers were defeated not by superior technology or tactics, but by psychological warfare that seemed to come from another century? Word of Churchill's exploits begins to spread through both armies. Allied commanders start requesting him for operations that require unconventional approaches, while German intelligence begins including specific warnings about British units that might employ experimental psychological warfare techniques. The longbow that began as one man's eccentricity has evolved into a weapon of strategic significance. But what you're beginning to understand is that Churchill's real innovation isn't the use of historical weapons. It's his understanding of how warfare is fundamentally about the human element. Technology, tactics, and strategy all matter, but at the end of the day, battles are won and lost in the minds of the people fighting them by introducing elements that don't fit established patterns. Churchill forces his enemies to fight battles they're not prepared for. During the spring offensive of 1941, your unit is assigned to operations that will test everything you've learned about unconventional warfare. German forces have adapted to some extent, with intelligence reports warning their troops about British units that might employ unusual tactics or non-standard equipment. But adapting to the unexpected is easier said than done, especially when the unexpected keeps evolving. Churchill's methods have become more sophisticated as he's learned to integrate medieval weapons with modern military doctrine. The longbow is no longer just about individual kills, it's become part of coordinated attacks that use its unique properties to maximum advantage. Silent elimination of key targets creates opportunities for conventional forces to exploit, while the psychological impact continues to disrupt enemy decision-making at critical moments. You participate in an operation that perfectly demonstrates how Churchill has evolved his techniques. The target is a German command post that controls communications for an entire sector. Conventional assault would be possible but costly, and the intelligence value of capturing the facility intact makes subtlety important. Churchill's approach combines medieval stealth techniques with modern reconnaissance, moving through terrain that German patrols consider impassable. He eliminates sentries with the longbow, while your unit positions itself to exploit the chaos that follows. But the real innovation is in the timing. Instead of pressing the attack immediately, Churchill uses the bagpipes to create a false impression of the assault's direction and strength. The German response reveals how effective his psychological warfare has become. Instead of mounting an organized defense of the command post, they assume they're facing a larger force than actually exists and begin implementing withdrawal procedures. By the time your unit moves in for the actual assault, most of the defenders have already abandoned positions that would have been extremely difficult to take by force. The operation succeeds with minimal casualties and maximum intelligence value, but more importantly, it demonstrates how Churchill's methods have evolved from individual eccentricity to systematic innovation. Other units begin requesting training on unconventional warfare techniques, and military planners start considering how historical weapons and tactics might be integrated into modern operations. But perhaps the most significant development is the impact on German strategic thinking. Intelligence reports suggest that German commanders are allocating resources to counter threats that largely exist in their imagination. Units are being trained to deal with British special forces employing medieval combat techniques, resources are being devoted to developing countermeasures for psychological warfare that depends on unconventional weapons, and entire operational plans are being modified to account for enemy capabilities that are both real and vastly overestimated. Churchill has achieved something that goes far beyond the tactical impact of his individual actions. By consistently operating outside established patterns, he's forced the enemy to waste resources preparing for threats that don't exist while remaining vulnerable to the threats that do. It's asymmetric warfare at its most elegant, using the enemy's own rationality against them by providing information that leads to logical but incorrect conclusions. As summer arrives, you find yourself part of operations that will define how unconventional warfare can be integrated into larger strategic objectives. The German Atlantic Wall is beginning to take shape, and Allied planners are looking for ways to gather intelligence and disrupt construction without alerting defenders to the larger preparations for invasion. Churchill's unit is assigned to raids that must appear random and opportunistic rather than part of systematic intelligence gathering. The challenge is to collect information and inflict damage while maintaining the impression that these are isolated actions by eccentric British forces rather than components of a coordinated strategic plan. The operations that follow showcase how thoroughly Churchill has mastered the integration of historical and modern warfare techniques. Longbow kills eliminate sentries without the distinctive signatures of modern weapons, allowing your unit to approach targets undetected. Bagpipe performances create false impressions about the size and nature of attacking forces, leading German commanders to make incorrect assumptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. But more significantly, Churchill begins using his reputation as a form of strategic deception. German intelligence has developed such elaborate theories about his methods and objectives that his mere presence in a sector causes defensive preparations completely disproportionate to the actual threat. Resources that should be devoted to strengthening the Atlantic Wall are instead directed toward countering imaginary special forces. Units armed with medieval weapons. You participate in a raid that perfectly demonstrates this dynamic. The target is a coastal observation post that provides intelligence about Allied shipping and potential invasion routes. The facility is lightly defended because German planners assumed that any serious attack would come from the sea and involve substantial forces. Churchill's approach turns these assumptions against the defenders. Approaching from inland using medieval stealth techniques, he eliminates the observation post guards with the longbow and begins transmitting false information using their equipment. But instead of simply destroying the facility and withdrawing, he stages an elaborate deception that suggests the raid was conducted by a much larger force using experimental equipment. The German response exceeds all expectations. Within days, the coastal sector receives reinforcements intended to counter British special forces that exist primarily in the imagination of German intelligence officers. Concrete and steel that should be strengthening beach defenses are instead used to build facilities designed to counter threats that Churchill has convinced them exist. By autumn, your unit has become something unique in military history, a strategic asset whose primary value lies not in its direct combat effectiveness, but in its ability to manipulate enemy perceptions and decisions. Churchill's longbow has evolved from an individual eccentricity to a tool of strategic deception that influences German planning at the highest levels. The culmination comes during the preliminary operations for what will eventually become the D-Day invasion. Your unit is tasked with reconnaissance missions that must gather intelligence while appearing to be random raids by unconventional British forces. The challenge is to collect information about German defenses without revealing the systematic nature of Allied intelligence gathering. Churchill's methods prove perfectly suited to this requirement. His raids appear so eccentric and personal that German intelligence fails to recognize them as components of larger strategic planning. Reports describe attacks by the British officer who fights with medieval weapons as isolated incidents rather than systematic reconnaissance. allowing Allied planners to gather crucial intelligence while maintaining operational security. The final operation you participate in before the invasion demonstrates how completely Churchill has mastered the art of strategic deception. The target is a German headquarters that coordinates coastal defenses for a key sector of the Atlantic Wall. Intelligence suggests that the facility contains detailed plans for defensive arrangements and response procedures that would be invaluable for invasion planning. Churchill's approach combines every technique he's developed over years of unconventional warfare. The longbow eliminates guards without alerting the facility's main garrison, while bagpipe performances create the impression of a larger attack from an unexpected direction. But the real innovation is in how he uses his reputation to shape German response. Instead of attempting to capture the facility quickly and withdraw, Churchill stages a prolonged siege that appears to be the work of a single obsessed individual, rather than a coordinated intelligence operation. German defenders, convinced they're dealing with the eccentric British officer they've heard so much about, respond according to patterns he's trained them to follow over months of unconventional operations. The siege succeeds in ways that go far beyond the immediate intelligence value. German forces respond by implementing defensive procedures designed to counter Churchill's specific methods, revealing capabilities and response times that Allied planners use to refine invasion plans. More importantly, the operation reinforces German assumptions about the nature of British unconventional warfare, ensuring that they continue to prepare for threats that exist largely in their imagination. When the invasion finally comes, you're part of operations that demonstrate how thoroughly Churchill's methods have prepared the ground for conventional success. German defenders, conditioned by months of encounters with unconventional British forces, initially assumed that the invasion itself might be another elaborate deception. Precious hours are lost while German commanders try to determine whether they're facing the real invasion or another psychological warfare operation designed to reveal their defensive capabilities. By the time German forces mount an organized response, Allied troops have established beachheads that might have been impossible to achieve against defenders who weren't confused about the nature of the threat they faced. Churchill's longbow didn't win the war, but it played a crucial role in creating the conditions that allowed conventional forces to succeed where they might otherwise have failed. In the aftermath of the invasion, as you're participating in the advance across France, you begin to understand the full scope of what Churchill accomplished. Military historians will eventually analyze his methods and their impact on German strategic thinking. But for now, you're witnessing the immediate results of years of unconventional warfare. German forces consistently respond to Allied advances, using countermeasures designed for threats that don't exist. Resources are allocated to counter British special forces armed with medieval weapons, while actual Allied capabilities catch defenders by surprise. It's asymmetric warfare at its most sophisticated, using the enemy's own intelligence and planning capabilities to create vulnerabilities that conventional attacks can exploit. Churchill continues to operate with his characteristic blend of medieval weapons and modern tactics, but now his methods are being studied and adapted by other units. The longbow, bagpipes, and claymore that began as personal eccentricities have evolved into recognized tools of psychological warfare and strategic deception. But perhaps, most significantly, you realize that Churchill has demonstrated something fundamental about the nature of warfare itself. Success doesn't always come from having better technology or superior numbers. Sometimes it comes from understanding which assumptions your enemy makes and how those assumptions can be turned against them by consistently operating outside established patterns. Churchill forced German forces to fight battles they weren't prepared for, using their own competence and rationality as weapons against them. As the war enters its final phase, you participate in operations that showcase how unconventional warfare can be integrated with conventional military doctrine to achieve strategic objectives that neither approach could accomplish alone. Churchill's unit has become a force multiplier, whose value extends far beyond its direct combat effectiveness. The liberation of German-occupied territories reveals the full extent of Churchill's impact on enemy thinking. Captured documents show that German planners devoted substantial resources to countering British special forces that existed primarily in intelligence reports influenced by Churchill's operations. Defensive positions were designed with capabilities that Allied forces didn't possess, while actual Allied strengths were underestimated because they didn't fit. German assumptions about British unconventional warfare in the war's final months. You witnessed Churchill's last major operation, a raid on a German research facility that allegedly contains experimental weapons designed to counter British psychological warfare techniques. The irony is, perfect German scientists have been developing countermeasures for unconventional tactics that work primarily because they're unexpected, not because they represent revolutionary military technology. Churchill's approach to the facility demonstrates how completely he's mastered the integration of medieval and modern warfare. The longbow eliminates guards, while modern explosives destroy research that was never particularly threatening. But more importantly, the raid reinforces German assumptions about British capabilities right up to the war's end, ensuring that resources continue to be devoted to preparing for threats that don't exist. When victory finally comes, you're part of the occupation forces that process German military records and interview captured officers. The stories they tell reveal how thoroughly Churchill's methods affected German thinking throughout the war. Officers describe elaborate theories about British Special Forces training, detailed analyses of psychological warfare techniques, and strategic plans modified to account for capabilities that existed primarily in their imagination. Years later, as military historians analyze the unconventional warfare techniques developed during World War II, Churchill's methods will be recognized as innovations that went far beyond their immediate tactical impact. By consistently operating outside established patterns, he demonstrated how individual creativity could influence strategic thinking at the highest levels. But for you, witnessing these events as they unfolded, the lesson is simpler and more profound. You've seen how one man with a longbow, a set of bagpipes, and an understanding of human psychology could change the nature of warfare itself. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but by refusing to accept limitations that existed, primarily in other people's assumptions about what was possible. The longbow that seemed so anachronistic in the trenches of World War II proved to be perfectly suited to a conflict where perception often mattered more than reality. Churchill's greatest victory wasn't any single battle or operation. It was his demonstration that innovation sometimes comes not from embracing the latest technology, but from understanding which old techniques still work and why they've been forgotten. As you reflect on everything you've witnessed, you realize that Churchill's story is ultimately about the power of individual creativity to challenge established assumptions and change the course of events. In a war defined by industrial-scale destruction and technological innovation, one man with medieval weapons proved that sometimes the most effective approach is the one nobody expects. The longbow may have been an ancient weapon, but in Churchill's hands, it became something revolutionary, a tool for fighting battles in the minds of enemies who thought they understood the rules of modern warfare, and in the end, those mental battles proved just as important as any fought with guns and artillery on the conventional battlefields of World War II. You walk away from this war carrying stories that challenge everything most people think they know about military history. You've seen how unconventional thinking can create opportunities that conventional wisdom would miss, how individual innovation can influence strategic outcomes, and how sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that changes the nature of the conflict itself. The trenches are behind you now, but the lessons remain. In a world that often assumes newer is always better, more is always superior, and conventional wisdom is always correct, You've witnessed proof that sometimes the most powerful approach is the one that nobody sees coming. Churchill's longbow reminds us that innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about rediscovering something old and understanding why it still works. The mist rises from the battlefield one final time, carrying with it the echoes of bagpipes and the whisper of arrows that changed the course of history, not through their destructive power, but through their ability to challenge assumptions and force enemies to fight battles they were never prepared to win. And somewhere in that mist, the ghost of Mad Jack Churchill continues his eternal patrol, proving that in warfare, as in life, the most effective strategy is often the one that nobody expects. As the smoke of countless battles finally clears, and you find yourself standing on ground that will soon be reclaimed by grass and wildflowers, you can still hear the phantom echo of those bagpipes dancing across the wind. If you enjoyed this ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about Churchill's unconventional methods, or share your own local time and where you're listening from right now. Maybe you've got your own stories about times when thinking outside the box changed everything. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive and your nights filled with wonder.
you.